Every empire writes its own version of history. But what if I told you that the version most of us grew up learning, the one that paints European colonial powers as explorers, traders, or civilizers, hides a darker, blood-soaked truth? The truth is that every European empire, from Britain to Belgium, from France to Portugal, committed acts so brutal, so deliberately inhumane, that their scars still shape the world we live in today. Entire nations were built on suffering, and yet most of what we know barely scratches the surface. Imagine this: millions of people forced from their homes, their languages banned, their names changed, their cultures erased. Families torn apart for profit, whole populations worked to death so that Europe could thrive. We call it colonization, but for many who lived through it, it was a never-ending nightmare, one that lasted for centuries. And here's the most chilling part. It wasn't just one bad king or one greedy company or one nation gone too far. These atrocities were systematic, planned, approved, and normalized across the board. Whether it was the British in India, the Belgians in Congo, or the Spanish in the Americas, each empire followed the same brutal blueprint: conquer, exploit, erase. But how do they all end up doing the same things? Torture, forced labor, starvation, and mass killings, even though they ruled different lands, spoke different languages, and claimed different motives. Was it greed, power, or something far more unsettling about human nature itself? Stay with me, because over the next few minutes, we're going to peel back the polished image of empire and expose what really happened beneath the flags and glory. And once you see it, you'll never look at history the same way again. In this video, we're not just revisiting old history. We're uncovering the patterns that connected every European empire in ways most of us were never taught. Because behind every grand palace in Europe, every monument of pride, and every story of progress, there's a trail of blood, bones, and broken cultures that made it all possible. We'll explore how these empires didn't just conquer land, they engineered systems of control that targeted the human spirit. They didn't just take resources, they took identities. And they didn't just commit isolated acts of cruelty, they built entire economies on exploitation. From Africa to Asia, the Caribbean to the Pacific, the brutality followed a script. One so consistent, it's almost as if the empires were reading from the same manual. By the end of this video, you'll begin to see how deeply colonial violence shaped today's world, from global wealth gaps to cultural hierarchies that still influence us today. You'll also discover why the legacies of these empires still echo in our languages, our borders, and even the way nations see themselves today. And somewhere in this story, there's one example so horrifying, so meticulously planned, that it was later used as inspiration for one of history's darkest regimes. We'll get to that soon. But first, let's uncover the disturbing similarities that every European empire shared, the blueprint of brutality that bound them all together. When you look closely at the way every European colonial empire operated, whether it was the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, or the Belgians, you start to see something unsettling. They all behaved almost identically. Different flags, different languages, different rulers, but the same script. It always began with a promise: trade, civilization, Christianity, order. But what followed was enslavement, exploitation, and the slow, calculated destruction of entire peoples. Let's start with the foundation of it all: enslavement and forced labor. For centuries, the transatlantic slave trade became Europe's most profitable business model. Millions of Africans were captured, chained, and shipped across oceans like cargo. The Portuguese started it, the British perfected it, and the French, Spanish, and Dutch eagerly joined in. Men, women, and children were sold, branded, and worked to death on plantations, their labor fueling Europe's wealth while leaving Africa drained of its people and potential. Even when slavery was officially abolished, it didn't stop. It simply evolved. The British replaced chains with taxes that forced locals to work for pennies. The French introduced labor obligations in their colonies. The Belgians in Congo demanded rubber quotas so severe that failure meant mutilation or death. And that brings us to systemic violence, not just war, but violence designed to maintain control. These empires didn't just want submission, they wanted fear. Entire villages were burned to the ground to make examples of those who resisted. In Namibia, under German colonial rule, the Herero and Nama people were driven into the desert and exterminated, one of the first genocides of the 20th century. In India, when peaceful protesters stood up to British laws, the empire responded with bullets, most infamously at the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, where hundreds were gunned down without warning. And the Belgian Congo, the cruelty there defied imagination. Colonial officers cut off hands to punish workers who didn't meet their rubber collection targets. It was so grotesque that even other European nations who were guilty of similar acts pretended to be shocked. But the brutality wasn't always physical. Cultural erasure was just as devastating. The slow death of identity. Every empire sought to rewrite the cultures it conquered. Indigenous names were replaced with European ones. Local religions were outlawed, and traditional systems of governance were dismantled. Schools taught colonized children that their own people were primitive, that salvation came only through European knowledge, European gods, and European tongues. Languages that had existed for thousands of years were intentionally destroyed. The Spanish banned indigenous languages across Latin America. The French outlawed African dialects in schools. The British made English the language of civilization. It wasn't just domination, it was the systematic deletion of memory. To see how eerily consistent this was, let's look at two very different colonies, the Congo under Belgium and India under Britain. In the Congo Free State, King Leopold II ran the territory like his personal corporation. Under the guise of bringing civilization, he orchestrated one of the deadliest exploitations in human history. Villages were raided, people enslaved, and millions died. Estimates range from 10 to 15 million. Photographs from that time show Congolese children staring blankly into the camera, their hands missing, their lives shattered. And yet, Leopold was celebrated in Europe as a philanthropist. Across the world in India, the British used a more civilized form of control: bureaucracy, trade laws, and famine. But make no mistake, the result was the same. Indian farmers were forced to grow cash crops like indigo and cotton instead of food, leading to mass starvation. During the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, while millions died of hunger, the British government continued exporting grain to feed their soldiers and allies. The empire didn't just watch people die, it profited from their suffering. Two continents, two empires, two completely different systems, and yet the same heartless results: wealth for Europe, death and devastation for everyone else. So how did it happen? How did nations separated by oceans and centuries of rivalry all end up following the same brutal playbook: enslave, exploit, erase? Was it coincidence, or was it the inevitable consequence of a worldview that saw other humans as expendable? The disturbing answer lies in how these empires justified their actions, not just to the world, but to themselves. And that's where the story turns even darker. If there's one place that captures the true horror of colonial brutality, it's the Congo under King Leopold II of Belgium. What happened there wasn't just exploitation, it was one of the deadliest human catastrophes in history, all in the name of profit. Leopold claimed he wanted to civilize Central Africa. In reality, he turned it into his personal business empire. Villages were forced to collect rubber from the forests, often walking miles barefoot through snake-infested swamps. Each adult had to meet a daily quota. Fail, and the punishment was beyond cruel. Soldiers cut off the hands of men, women, and even children as proof that bullets weren't wasted. Whole villages were massacred when quotas weren't met. By the time the world finally caught on, an estimated 10 million Congolese people were dead. That's more than the population of Belgium itself at the time. And yet, for years, European newspapers praised Leopold as a humanitarian king. But Belgium wasn't alone. Across the Indian Ocean, the British Empire in India mastered a quieter, more bureaucratic cruelty. For nearly 2 centuries, Britain drained India's wealth, raw materials, textiles, and crops, while taxing its people into poverty. But perhaps nothing reveals the empire's coldness like its famines. During the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, over 3 million Indians starved to death, not because there wasn't enough food, but because British policies prioritized exports over lives. Trains loaded with rice left Bengal to feed their British soldiers abroad, while families at home withered and died in the streets. Winston Churchill, then Prime Minister, dismissed the tragedy, blaming the victims themselves and saying, "Indians breed like rabbits." It wasn't just indifference, it was contempt, disguised as governance.
Then there was France in Algeria, where the brutality was both psychological and physical. When Algerians demanded independence in the mid-20th century, France responded with overwhelming force. Entire villages were bombed, prisoners were tortured, and thousands disappeared without a trace. French soldiers used electrocution, beatings, and waterboarding during interrogations. Women were assaulted, families destroyed, and yet France insisted it was maintaining order. Even decades later, France struggled to acknowledge the atrocities. It took until the 21st century for a French president to admit, officially, that systematic torture had taken place. And then there were the Portuguese colonies, Angola and Mozambique, often overlooked but no less brutal. Portugal clung to its colonies long after most European powers had left, enforcing a system called chibalo, forced labor in the fields, mines, and construction sites. African men were seized from their homes and sent to work without pay, sometimes for years, under conditions so harsh that death was often seen as an escape. Women and children suffered too, beaten, starved, and used as leverage to ensure men returned to work. Portugal justified it as development. In truth, it was slavery reborn under a different name. Each of these empires told the same lie, that they were bringing progress, Christianity, or civilization. But beneath those noble words lay an empire-wide machinery of greed and dehumanization. Different rulers, different flags, but the same logic, that one group of humans had the right to dominate another. And what's most chilling is that some of these colonial systems became the inspiration for later horrors. Methods of population control, forced labor, and racial hierarchy. They were studied, copied, and refined in the following century by regimes that would plunge the world into even darker times. And that was just one empire. Wait until you hear what happened across the Atlantic, where colonization didn't just take lives, but erased entire civilizations. Even after the flags were lowered and the empires officially ended, the scars of colonial rule didn't disappear. They were etched into the minds, cultures, and economies of the colonized nations. Entire generations grew up carrying trauma they didn't create, yet couldn't escape. Parents passed down stories of massacres, starvation, and forced labor. Children inherited not only the memory of loss, but the psychological weight of being deemed less than for centuries. This isn't just history, it's a living legacy, visible in poverty, inequality, and social divisions that persist to this day. Cultural erasure compounded the psychological damage. Languages were banned, traditional religions outlawed, and entire educational systems designed to erase local identity. Think of a child growing up being told their history doesn't matter, their language is inferior, and their culture is primitive. That systematic stripping of identity didn't just hurt people at the time, it left gaps in heritage, family knowledge, and community cohesion that generations are still trying to recover.
In some African nations, colonial borders split ethnic groups or forced rival tribes together, creating tensions that still spark conflict today.
Economically, the consequences are just as devastating. Colonial powers extracted raw materials, redirected trade, and left behind systems designed to keep local economies dependent rather than self-sustaining. The railways, ports, and infrastructure they built were primarily for export, moving resources from colonies to Europe, not connecting communities internally. Even now, former colonies struggle with economies shaped more by extraction than by development, and the wealth that fueled Europe's rise was built on the backs of millions. So pause for a moment and ask yourself, could the wealth, power, and influence of Europe really have been built without these deliberate actions, without violence, without exploitation, without cultural erasure? Every policy, every act of control, every famine, every forced labor system contributed not only to European prosperity, but to the enduring challenges faced by generations of colonized peoples. Understanding this isn't about blaming the present, but seeing clearly how the past continues to shape the world we live in today. And yet, even in the darkest chapters, people resisted, adapted, and survived. Sometimes in ways so subtle, so clever, that they turned the tools of oppression against their oppressors. The stories of that resistance are what we'll explore next. For centuries, we've been fed a neat, polished version of colonial history, the kind that paints European empires as benevolent bringers of civilization, education, and religion. They built schools, hospitals, and railways, history books tell us, as if these acts erase the mountains of suffering underneath. But the reality is far messier, far darker. Civilization wasn't the goal, control was. And whenever it seemed like a colony was thriving, it was often on the backs of exploited labor, coerced resources, and lives destroyed in silence. Many of the atrocities committed by colonial powers are barely mentioned in mainstream education. Textbooks skim over massacres, famines, and systemic torture, and often frame them as collateral damage or unfortunate consequences of progress. Entire rebellions are reduced to footnotes, entire cultures reduced to statistics. The Belgian Congo, for instance, is remembered in passing as a historical footnote, rather than as the site of one of the most calculated, horrifying campaigns of violence in modern history. Meanwhile, the resistance, ingenuity, and survival strategies of colonized peoples are almost never celebrated. And these stories of resistance are astounding. In India, farmers and local leaders found clever ways to undermine British trade monopolies without ever facing direct confrontation. In Africa, communities hid children, sabotaged production lines, and preserved languages and customs in secret, keeping culture alive under the very noses of their oppressors. Yet, when uprisings became unavoidable, the response was brutal. Consider the Maji-Maji Rebellion in German East Africa in 1905. Thousands of Africans rose up against forced cotton cultivation, believing in a spiritual water protection that would shield them from bullets. They fought with courage, hope, and desperation. The German response was merciless. Scorched earth campaigns, mass executions, and deliberate famine. Estimates suggest that over 250,000 people died, wiped out for daring to resist. And yet, many of us have never even heard of this rebellion in school. These hidden truths remind us that colonialism was not a benevolent civilizing mission. It was a deliberate system of oppression, one that crushed life, liberty, and identity, while simultaneously trying to erase the memory of resistance. And it's in these stories of suppressed courage and unrecorded defiance that we find the real heartbeat of history, a truth that will shape how we understand the legacies of empire in the world today. Next, we'll explore how all of this continues to affect nations and people in the present day, and why understanding these patterns matters now more than ever. The history of European colonial empires isn't just a story of the past, it's a lens through which we can better understand the present. Many of the systemic inequalities we see today, from extreme wealth gaps to political instability, are directly linked to the structures these empires built.
When we trace the roots of economic exploitation, social hierarchies, and cultural suppression, patterns emerge that are shockingly familiar. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward addressing them. It's not about blaming today's generation for the sins of the past. It's about learning from history so that we don't repeat it. One of the most powerful ways to confront this legacy is by preserving and reclaiming cultural heritage. Languages that were banned, traditions that were suppressed, and histories that were erased are all vital to a society's identity. When communities reclaim their stories, honor their ancestors, and revive their customs, they rebuild more than culture. They restore dignity, pride, and resilience that colonial powers tried to destroy. Understanding colonial history also helps us spot modern forms of exploitation. From multinational corporations extracting resources from vulnerable countries to policies that prioritize profit over human welfare, the echoes of empire are everywhere. Recognizing these patterns allows us to question systems that seem normal but are built on inequity, and to advocate for justice in ways that matter. The key takeaway is simple but profound. History isn't just a record of what happened, it's a map of how power works, how inequality is maintained, and how human ingenuity can resist oppression. By studying it honestly, we equip ourselves with the knowledge to create a fairer, more just world.